Thank you very much, Shmuel. Since the U.S. is Israel's only strategic ally, upon which Israel so greatly depends in so many areas, the American presidential election is obviously of great importance to Israel. But I want to suggest that the actual differences between a potential second Obama term or first Romney term on foreign policy will be only at the margins. The predominant issues in the election will be the economy and the perception in the months leading up to the election of whether or not the economy is sufficiently improving, whether there is light at the end of the tunnel, to instill enough confidence in swing voters in what will be a very close election that the president deserves to be elected to a second term. In this regard, Chancellor Merkel and her EU colleagues will have perhaps as much impact on the election as Romney will, because a great deal of the problems we're facing in the last few months with job creation has come because of the uncertainties created by the euro crisis. Foreign policy will not be a voting issue for most voters, and I'll suggest even for American Jewish voters. Governor Romney has spent very little time and will spend very little time in the balance of his campaign laying out a comprehensive foreign policy. He has taken some shots at the president for being too weak on Russia, which he says is America's greatest foreign policy threat, China, and on the president's decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan by 2014. And most pertinent here, he has suggested that President Obama has turned his back and mistreated our ally Israel, in his terms, throwing Israel under the bus. The only foreign policy issues which will have any domestic political resonance are those on Cuba, where Governor Romney will stake out a stronger anti-Castro position than the president to appeal to Cuban Americans in South Florida, where Congressman Wexler has come from, illegal immigration, and on Israel, where American Jews, although only 2% of the population, are close to 4% of the voters, and where they are key voters in crucial states like Florida and Pennsylvania. By any objective measure, this should be an election for Romney to have an enormous advantage. Because if the economy is the key issue, and it is, the facts are that no incumbent president of the United States has ever been reelected when unemployment was over 8%. Today it is 8.2%, and it's not likely to go much lower between now and November. It's difficult for you in Israel, who have largely been shielded because of the excellent management of the economy by your Prime Minister and by Stan Fisher, to appreciate the depth of the hurt of the American public from the Great Recession that started in 2008, 2009. We lost over 8 million jobs, and economists believe that it may be as late as 2017 before we regain those jobs together with natural job growth to keep up with the rising population. We have the highest long-term unemployed numbers, that is, unemployed for more than 6 months, since the Great Depression. And a study just out by the Federal Reserve only a week ago shows that median family wealth, that is the level at which half the families are above and half below, in just the last 3 years, declined by 40%, taking that median family level to 1992 levels and wiping out 20 years of gain. So those are all figures which should greatly help the challenger. American Jews are obviously very engaged But I want to suggest to you that in ways you may not appreciate, that Israel is only one of the voting issues for them. Let me give you a few examples. In 2004, Senator John Kerry won 74% of the Jewish vote against the strongest pro-Israel president in recent memory, George W. Bush. In 2008, Senator Obama, then an unknown on Israel, won 78% of the Jewish vote against a longtime supporter of Israel, Senator McCain. A recent survey by the American Jewish Committee of a profile of American Jews taken just a few months ago shows that if the election were held now, that 67% of Jewish voters would vote for Obama and 33% for Romney, actually a troubling figure for the president, who will need to get that number up. But equally important and rather surprising, the question was asked, which are the most important issues as you go into the voting booth to vote on? Israel's was only by 6% of the American Jews voted the number one issue. Only 22% of American Jews said it was one of their top three issues. And indeed, issues like the economy, health care, taxes, and national security all stood as more important issues than U.S.-Israel relations, according to this poll. There is one other polling figure that I'd like to give you and then move into the balance of my talk and my conclusions. And that is a recent Gallup poll that found very strong support, over 80%, of self-identified Republicans, not Jewish, Republicans in general, had a very positive view of Israel. 71% of independents, but only 65% of Democratic voters. A deep concern. Despite the seeming advantage on the economy, I'd like to predict that in a very, very close race that is now a toss-up, there'll be a slight advantage to the president. And that is because elections are decided on a state-by-state basis and under the Electoral College, and in some 9 to 10 states, which are called battleground states. Those are states that in each instance, the president won in 2008. He is unlikely to win all of them, but he has room for some slippage. In addition, more voters blame the current terrible state of the economy on President Bush than on Obama. And slightly more voters support President Obama's policies to correct the economy than Governor Romney's. More voters resonate to the president's message of fairness and shared sacrifice than Romney's message of less government and more free enterprise. And on what is a very personal vote for Americans when they vote for president, that is the likability factor. The president is still highly liked and trusted. He has strong ground organization and a demographic advantage among minorities and women. Now, will this make a difference? Will it make a difference who wins? Of course it does. But I want to suggest to you not as much difference on foreign policy as you would think. And that is because of a number of factors, the most important of which is that there is a certain continuity of foreign policy, and with perhaps one or two exceptions of particular importance to Israel, that continuity comes from a number of factors. And the continuity, by the way, will apply as much to a second Obama term as it would to a first Romney term. The notion that the president will somehow be freed of political constraints in a second term is illusory. And the reason for this continuity is the following. First, there is much more bipartisanship in foreign than in domestic policy. For example, bipartisan support for Israel. Second, decisions made by a president's predecessors tend to lock them in. For example, the president's decision on withdrawal from Afghanistan by 2014 is unlikely to be reversed by a President Romney. And likewise, policies like the policy of the Quad toward Hamas, the conditions for recognizing and negotiating with Hamas, are unlikely to change. In addition, the realities of global politics tend to push presidents to continue previous policies. It's fine rhetorically in the campaign to try to poke a finger in the eye of China and Russia. But when you have to deal with them as president and recognize that if we want a coalition against Iran on its nuclear program, we need Russia and China, then some of the rhetoric of the campaign gets thrown overboard. The same is true about Governor Romney's criticism about defense cuts that are being proposed by President Obama. When he comes into office and has to face a massive budget deficit, he may find he's locked into the same kinds of reductions. And the same is true of outreach to the new post-Islamic governments in the wake of the Arab revolt. There are 400 million Arabs in the Middle East and 1.6 billion Muslims. They can't be ignored, and President Romney wouldn't be able to either. In addition, some of the programs in foreign policy which the president has been following are very widely popular, like, for example, his attack on terrorism, killing of Osama bin Laden, the drone attacks against al-Qaeda in Pakistan and in Yemen. Now, having said that, there are areas of difference, and those are areas of particular importance to Israel. For one thing, the Republican Party today is philosophically closely aligned on Middle East policy with the Likud party, the dominant party here. And indeed, we find that some of the financial supporters are the same for both. On the Middle East peace process, therefore, I would suggest to you that there may be a difference in that the Obama administration has tended to feel there is a linkage between peace between Israel and the Palestinians and broader U.S. interests in rallying moderates in the Arab world. That is a linkage which I think Governor Romney and President Romney would not follow. Democratic presidents, whether Carter, Clinton, or Obama, tend to be more engaged in the Middle East peace process than Republican presidents. My guess is that a President Romney would give freer hand to Israel to expand settlements, part of the sort of greater Israel argument, as President George W. Bush did. And I'll leave it up to you to decide whether that is a good or bad thing. At the same time, even here, a President Romney could not ignore the peace process. He can't ignore the Palestinians. He can't ignore the Arab Middle East. And particularly when your own Prime Minister only 2 weeks ago talked about his opposition to a bi-national state and to permanent control over the Palestinians, it therefore puts the onus on an incoming president to back that up with U.S. support. And last is Iran. Would there be a difference on Iran? Well, rhetorically, Governor Romney has suggested he would be more supportive of unilateral military action. But I want to suggest to you that my belief is that in his first year in office, just as in the first year of a second Obama term, neither would be terribly likely unless absolutely necessary, unless sanctions and diplomacy had utterly failed, to launch a military attack, because each has to consider the ramifications on oil prices, on a still stagnant U.S. economy, on potential retaliation against not only Israeli but U.S. assets in the region, upon the coalition that's been built to support the sanctions against Iran. Each person would have to take those into account. Having said that, a President Romney may be more willing to give a wink and a nod to an Israeli attack, but by then, January, February, March of 2013, we'll frankly know one way or the other whether diplomacy and sanctions have failed, and I would believe that either a President Obama in a second term or a President Romney in a first term will feel the need, if all else has failed, to take major action, whether military or cyber attacks, to deal with a situation both candidates and Israel feel is an unacceptable risk. So my basic message is continuity will be the order of the day. There will be differences at the margin, but don't expect that in a second Obama term or a first Romney term there will be dramatic changes in policy anywhere in the world, including in the Middle East. Thank you.